the reluctant alliance. Commander Lyra Voss stood at the observation deck of the Imperial warship Sovereign Dawn, her silver eyes fixed on the debris field that had once been the 4th Defense Fleet. Twisted metal and frozen bodies drifted through the darkness of space like leaves scattered by a storm. 200 ships. 30,000 souls. Gone in less than 6 hours. She pressed her palm against the cold transparent steel window, her reflection staring back at her. Lyra was tall even by Tauron standards, standing nearly 7 feet with the characteristic blue-gray skin and silver markings that denoted her warrior caste. Her white hair was bound in the traditional commander's braid, woven with silver threads that represented each of her 17 victories. 17 victories that now seemed meaningless against the enemy they faced. The Skorliks had appeared 3 years ago from beyond the galactic rim. They were not conquerors seeking territory or resources seeking diplomacy. They were a swarm, a plague of insectoid creatures that consumed everything in their path. Their ships were grown rather than built, dark organic things that moved through space like schools of predatory fish. Worst of all, they learned. Every tactic the Tauron used against them worked only once before the Skorliks adapted and countered. The Tauron Empire had ruled this sector for 5,000 years. They were the finest warriors in known space, bred and trained from birth for combat. Their energy lances could pierce any shield, their barrier technology was impenetrable, and their battle formations were studied in military academies across a dozen species. They had never lost a war. Until now. Behind her, the door to the observation deck hissed open. Lyra did not turn. She knew who it would be. Commander Voss, Admiral Torith said, his voice carrying the weight of bad news. The Council has reached their decision. Lyra finally turned to face her superior officer. Admiral Torith was ancient by their standards, nearly 400 years old, his silver markings faded to white with age. He had fought in more wars than Lyra had been alive, and she had never seen defeat in his eyes. Until now. What do they demand? Lyra asked, though she already suspected the answer. Torith walked to the window looking out at the debris field. The humans have agreed to provide military support. Their fleet will arrive within the week. The humans? Lyra could not keep the disdain from her voice. The species that only learned to travel faster than light 2 centuries ago? The ones who still use chemical propellants for some of their weapons. The same, Torith said quietly. They are the only ones who answered our call. The Vrex Collective has sealed their borders. The Moth Sovereignty is negotiating with the Skorliks for safe passage. The Crystalline Choir has simply vanished into deep space. Only the humans have offered aid. Lyra laughed bitterly. How generous of them. And what price do these primitive newcomers demand for their assistance? Torith was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. An alliance sealed by tradition. A marriage bond between their military representative and a member of our royal command structure. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. A marriage bond. The oldest form of alliance among spacefaring species. A ceremony that linked not just individuals but entire civilizations. It was meant to be an honor, a joining of noble houses. But this was desperation dressed in ceremony. I am the last of the Voss line, Lyra said slowly. My brother died defending the colony worlds. My parents perished when the Skorliks destroyed our homeworld's orbital ring. The Council chose me because I have no choice. You always have a choice, Torith said. But sometimes all our choices lead to the same necessary end. Lyra closed her eyes. 30,000 dead in the debris field outside. Billions more across the Empire waiting to share their fate. Her pride meant nothing against those numbers. When do I meet this human? She asked. Tomorrow. The ceremony will take place aboard the Galactic Council station. Afterward, you will both return here to coordinate the defense. Lyra nodded once, a sharp military gesture. Then I will do my duty as I always have. The next day, Lyra stood in the ceremonial chamber of the Council station, wearing the formal armor of her rank. The plates were polished to a mirror shine, engraved with the history of her victories. She wore them like a shield, a reminder to herself and everyone watching that she was still a warrior, regardless of what came next. The chamber was filled with representatives from the few species that still maintained diplomatic relations with the Tauron. They whispered among themselves, their many eyes and sensory organs focused on her. She could feel their pity like acid on her skin. Then the human delegation entered and the whispers stopped. There were 5 of them, wearing dark blue uniforms that seemed plain compared to the ornate dress of the other species. They moved with a quiet efficiency that Lyra recognized from veteran soldiers. But her attention focused on the man leading them. Captain James Sullivan was unremarkable by any standard. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall, average for his species, with brown hair cut short in a military style. His skin was pale compared to most humans she had seen in the information files, and his eyes were a light gray color. He wore his uniform simply, with only a few ribbons and insignia that meant nothing to her. His face was calm, neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts. When their eyes met across the chamber, James gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Nothing more. No attempt to smile or ingratiate himself. Just a simple recognition of her presence, warrior to warrior. Despite herself, Lyra felt a small measure of respect. At least he understood this was business. The ceremony was mercifully brief. The council speaker read the terms of alliance in 6 languages. Lyra spoke her vows in formal Tauroni, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. James repeated his own vows in surprisingly good Tauroni, though his accent was thick and strange. When it was done, they were bound by law and tradition, their fates and the fates of their peoples intertwined. As the other delegates began to leave, James approached her. Up close, she could see the signs of experience in his face. Small scars, lines around his eyes, the weathered look of someone who had spent years in difficult conditions. "Commander Voss," he said in English, which her translator rendered in real time. "I want you to know I understand this isn't what you wanted. I don't expect anything beyond what our duty requires." Lyra studied him carefully. Was this false humility? Some human custom she did not understand? But she saw only sincerity in those gray eyes. "What do you expect, Captain Sullivan?" she asked. "To fight alongside your people," James replied. "To learn from your experience. And to help in whatever way we can." Help. The word came out sharper than she intended. "Captain, my people have been warriors for 5,000 years. We have weapons and tactics your species cannot even imagine. What help could you possibly offer?" James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. Sometimes fresh eyes see things that experienced ones miss. Sometimes the newest student asks the question that breaks through to a solution. "Philosophy," Lyra said dismissively. "We need weapons and ships, not wisdom." "We brought both," James said simply. 25 ships and their crews. We'll follow your command structure and adapt to your tactics. All we ask is that you keep an open mind." 25 ships. Lyra had lost more than that in single engagements. But she forced herself to nod. "Your fleet will be integrated into our formation as support vessels. Stay behind the main battle line and provide covering fire when ordered. Do not take independent action without authorization." "Understood," James said. "Though I hope you'll allow me to observe your battle planning sessions. I want to learn how the Tauron fight." "You will learn by watching," Lyra said. "The council chamber aboard my flagship has observation positions. You may attend, but you will not speak unless asked a direct question. Our military traditions are not to be questioned by outsiders." James gave another of those small nods. "Of course. I'll respect your traditions." 3 days later, the human fleet arrived at the Sovereign Dawn's position. Lyra watched from the command deck as their ships took up position in the formation. The vessels were smaller than Tauron warships, with dark angular hulls that looked rough and unfinished. Where Tauron ships were elegant curves and flowing lines, human ships were all sharp edges and brutal functionality. "They look like cargo haulers," Commander Varix muttered beside her. He was her second in command, a veteran of countless battles who had served under her father. "Appearances can be deceiving," Lyra said, though she privately agreed with his assessment. The human ships looked crude and primitive compared to the sleek white hulls of the Tauron fleet. James had been given quarters near hers, as tradition demanded for bonded pairs. She had made it clear through her staff that she expected privacy except during official duties. To his credit, the human had not argued or complained. He spent most of his time either on his own ship or in the tactical archive, reviewing recordings of previous battles against the Skorliks. Late that night, Lyra could not sleep. The weight of command pressed down on her, as it always did before battle. Long-range sensors had detected Skorlik's movement in the adjacent system. They would arrive within 48 hours. She walked through the quiet corridors of her flagship, seeking the solitude of the tactical archive. But when she entered, she found James already there, surrounded by holographic displays showing battle data. He looked up as she entered, then immediately stood in a gesture of respect. "Commander. I apologize, I didn't realize anyone else would be here at this hour." "This is my ship, Captain," Lyra said coldly. "I go where I please." "Of course." James gestured to the displays. I was reviewing the engagement records from the Battle of Cross Nebula. Would you prefer I leave? Lyra almost said yes. But something in the focused intensity on his face made her pause. She had seen that look before on the faces of true students of warfare, those who sought understanding rather than glory. What have you learned? She asked instead. James turned back to the displays. The Skorliks use a pattern I've seen before, though not in space combat. They attack like pack hunters, targeting isolated units and using coordinated strikes to overwhelm local defenses. But there's something else. He highlighted several sections of the battle recording. They're learning from you faster than you're learning from them. Every time your fleet uses a formation or tactic, they adapt to it within the same engagement. I am aware of this, Lyra said. It is why we are losing. They evolve faster than we can innovate. But evolution has weaknesses, James said quietly. Adaptation requires pattern recognition. If you give them patterns to recognize, they'll optimize against those patterns. But if you break the patterns entirely, if you do things that don't fit their learned responses, they'll have nothing to adapt to. Lyra frowned. You suggest chaos? Random tactics? That is not how civilized warfare is conducted. I'm suggesting unpredictability, James corrected. Not random but varied. Change not just what you do but how you think about the problem. The Tauron way of war has served us for 5,000 years, Lyra said, her voice carrying an edge of warning. We do not abandon tradition lightly. James met her gaze steadily. How many of those 5,000 years were spent losing? The words should have been an insult, grounds for discipline. But Lyra heard no mockery in his voice, only a simple question seeking a simple answer. None, she admitted. We have never lost a war until now. Then maybe, James said carefully, what worked for 5,000 years doesn't work against an enemy that learns as fast as the Skorliks. Maybe tradition becomes a weakness when the enemy can predict every move you make based on that tradition. Lyra was silent, staring at the holographic display showing her people's repeated defeats. Every battle showed the same pattern. The Tauron would form their traditional formations, advance with disciplined precision and fight with honor and courage. And the Skorliks would shred them apart because they knew exactly what was coming. What would you do differently? She asked quietly. James looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she truly wanted to hear his answer. Then he began to explain, showing her examples from human military history, battles where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through deception, misdirection, and adaptation. He spoke of ancient generals and modern commanders who had won by refusing to fight the way their enemies expected. Lyra listened, saying little, her mind racing. Everything James suggested went against her training, her traditions, her understanding of honorable warfare. But as she watched the recordings of her people dying in space, she realized that honor meant nothing to the dead. When James finally finished, the ship's chronometer showed that 3 hours had passed. Lyra stood, her body stiff from standing motionless for so long. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Captain, she said formally. I will consider them. James nodded. That's all I ask, Commander. As Lyra walked back to her quarters, her mind churned with possibilities. The humans' ideas were radical, even heretical by Tauron standards. But they were also the first new approach she had heard that didn't simply repeat the same failed strategies. 2 days later, the Skorliks arrived. 47 enemy ships emerged from hyperspace at the system's edge, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that served as their communication system. They formed their typical swarm pattern, spreading out in a loose cloud that would surround and engulf any traditional battle formation. On the command deck of the Sovereign Dawn, Lyra looked at her assembled officers. Veterans, all warriors who had served with distinction. They waited for her orders, confident in their training and their traditions. She thought of James's words. She thought of 30,000 dead floating in space. She thought of her duty to save as many of her people as possible. We will not use Formation Delta, she announced. Instead, we split our forces into 3 groups. Groups Alpha and Beta will engage from opposite flanks while Group Gamma holds in reserve. When the enemy commits to either flank, Gamma will strike their exposed center. All groups will operate with independent authority to break formation and pursue targets of opportunity. The silence on the command deck was deafening. Commander Varric stared at her as if she had spoken in an alien language. Commander, he said carefully, that violates every principle of coordinated fleet action. If our formations break apart, we lose our defensive cohesion. We also become unpredictable, Lyra countered. The Skorliks adapt to patterns. We will give them no pattern to adapt to. This is madness, another officer said. We will be slaughtered. Lyra looked at each of them in turn. We have been slaughtered following tradition. Perhaps it is time we try something new. She paused. Captain Sullivan, you will coordinate Group Gamma with your human ships. When you see your moment to strike, you will take it without waiting for orders. James, who had been standing quietly in the observation area, stepped forward. Understood, Commander. We won't let you down. The battle began an hour later. The Tauron fleet split into 3 groups as ordered, breaking every rule of their military doctrine. The Skorliks responded with what appeared to be confusion, their swarm pattern dispersing as they tried to track multiple threat vectors. Groups Alpha and Beta engaged from opposite sides of the enemy formation. Instead of advancing in rigid lines, they moved in irregular patterns, ships breaking away to pursue targets then rejoining their squadrons in unpredictable positions. The Skorliks tried to adapt, but before they could establish a counter pattern, the Tauron ships would shift again. And then the human ship struck. Group Gamma had been holding back, appearing to be a reserve force. But as the Skorliks concentrated on the 2 flanking groups, James led his 25 ships straight into the heart of the enemy formation. The human vessels moved with a precision that shocked Lyra. They didn't fly like cargo haulers. They flew like hunting birds, darting and weaving through enemy fire with an agility that seemed impossible for ships of their size. The human weapons were different too. Instead of the sustained energy lances the Tauron used, they fired rapid bursts of kinetic projectiles and short-range missiles. The damage was devastating at close range, punching through Skorlik's bioarmor with brutal efficiency. But it was the tactics that impressed Lyra most. The human ships didn't fight alone. They moved in pairs and trios, covering each other's approaches and withdrawals. When one ship drew enemy fire, its wingmates would strike from blind angles. They used the debris from destroyed Skorlik ships as cover, hiding behind the wreckage before emerging to strike again. The Skorliks tried to adapt, tried to surround the human ships and overwhelm them with numbers. But James anticipated every move, pulling his forces back before they could be trapped, then striking from a new direction before the enemy could reposition. 2 hours into the battle, something unprecedented happened. The Skorliks began to withdraw. On the command deck of the Sovereign Dawn, Lyra watched in disbelief as the enemy swarm pulled back, regrouping at the system's edge. They had damaged the enemy fleet, yes, but not enough to force a retreat. The Skorliks should have been pressing their numerical advantage. They're confused, James said over the communication channel. They can't predict what we're going to do next, and that's making them cautious. This is our chance to press the advantage. All ships, Lyra ordered, her voice carrying new confidence. Pursue and maintain pressure. Do not let them regroup. The combined Tauron and human fleet surged forward. For the first time in 3 years, it was the Skorliks who were reacting to them instead of the other way around. The enemy tried to reform their swarm pattern, but the chaotic assault gave them no time to coordinate. By the time the battle ended 4 hours later, the Skorliks had lost 19 ships. The Tauron had lost 3, all from Group Alpha before they had fully adapted to the new tactics. The human fleet had taken damage but suffered no destroyed ships. As the enemy remnants fled into hyperspace, the Tauron fleet erupted in celebration. Commanders who had objected to the new tactics now praised Lyra's brilliance. Officers who had called it madness now called it genius. But Lyra knew the truth. She stood on her command deck, looking at the tactical displays, and she felt something she had not felt in 3 years. Oh. James appeared on the command deck an hour later, his uniform scorched and dirty from putting out a fire on his ship's engineering deck. His face was tired but alive with the energy that came after surviving a battle. Commander Voss, he said formally. Group Gamma reporting mission complete. Lyra looked at him, this unremarkable human who had just helped her people win their first real victory against the Skorliks. She thought about how she had dismissed him, how she had looked at his primitive ships and quiet demeanor and seen only weakness. Captain Sullivan, she said, her voice carrying through the silent command deck. You and your crews fought with honor and skill today. The Tauron Empire is fortunate to have you as allies. James gave one of his characteristic small nods. We're fortunate to fight alongside warriors of your caliber. Your people adapted to new tactics in the middle of battle. That takes discipline and trust. Perhaps, Lyra said quietly, we both have much to learn from each other. For the first time since the marriage ceremony, James smiled. It was a small expression, but genuine. I'd like that, Commander. I'd like that very much. As the celebration continued around them, Lyra felt the weight on her shoulders shift slightly. It was still there, the burden of command and responsibility. But now it felt shared, distributed between her people and these strange humans who fought like nothing she had ever seen. The war was far from over. The Skrulix would adapt to these new tactics eventually, and then they would need to adapt again. But for the first time in 3 years, Lyra believed they might actually have a chance to win. And standing beside her, quiet and unremarkable and utterly essential, was the human she had married out of duty. Perhaps, she thought, duty sometimes brought unexpected gifts. The god of war awakens. The weeks following the first victory were unlike anything Lyra had experienced in her military career. Instead of the grinding desperation that had defined every day since the Skrulix invasion began, there was now a cautious optimism spreading through the fleet. But with that optimism came a new challenge. Learning to fight in ways that contradicted everything the Tauron had believed about warfare for 5 millennia. James had become a fixture in the tactical planning rooms, no longer relegated to silent observation. Lyra had granted him full participation in strategy sessions, a decision that had caused considerable friction among her senior officers. Commander Varix, in particular, made no secret of his displeasure. "He is an outsider," Varix said during one heated meeting. "His people have barely left their own solar system, and we are allowing him to reshape our entire military doctrine?" "His people," Lyra responded coolly, "helped us achieve our first victory in 3 years. Unless you have a better suggestion, Commander, I suggest you listen to what he has to say." But even Lyra had not anticipated how deeply James would immerse himself in understanding the enemy. He spent every spare moment in the tactical archive, reviewing battle recordings until his eyes were red from exhaustion. He interviewed survivors from destroyed ships, asking detailed questions about Skrulix behavior patterns. He even requested access to captured Skrulix biological samples, studying their physiology to understand how their hive communication worked. One evening, Lyra found him in the archive again, surrounded by holographic displays showing hundreds of data points. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn. She noticed he had lost weight since joining the fleet, his uniform hanging looser on his frame. "Captain," she said, her voice softer than she intended, "when did you last sleep?" James looked up, seeming surprised to see her. "Commander. I apologize, I lost track of time." He gestured to the displays. "I think I've found something important." Lyra moved closer, studying the complex web of data. "What am I looking at?" "Skrulix attack patterns over the past 3 years, James explained, his voice gaining energy despite his obvious fatigue. "Every engagement, every target they've chosen, plotted against time and location. Do you see it?" Lyra studied the display, her tactical training allowing her to process the information quickly. And then she saw it. The pattern was subtle, but it was there. They are moving in a spiral, starting from the galactic rim and working inward toward the core systems. "Exactly," James said. "But it's more than just geography. Look at what they're targeting." He highlighted specific points. Military shipyards, research stations, breeding colonies. They're not just consuming resources randomly. They're systematically destroying your ability to rebuild and resist. "We knew they were intelligent," Lyra said. "This simply confirms it. But if we know their pattern, we can predict their next moves," James said, pulling up a new display. "Based on their current position and their historical trajectory, their next major target will be here." He pointed to a system marked in Tauron blue. "The Korvax system. Your third largest military production facility." Lyra felt her blood turn cold. The Korvax system was home to 17 billion Tauron citizens. It produced 40% of their remaining warships and 60% of their advanced weapons systems. If the Skrulix took Korvax, the war would effectively be over. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Based on their movement speed and fleet consolidation patterns, I estimate 12 to 14 days before they launch their assault. But here's the critical part." James pulled up another display showing Skrulix fleet movements. "They're gathering forces from multiple systems. This isn't going to be a raid or a skirmish. They're committing everything for a decisive strike. Then we will meet them with everything we have," Lyra said. "I will call for every available ship to defend Korvax." "That's what they expect," James said quietly. "And if we meet them in a conventional defense, we'll lose. They're bringing at least 300 ships, Commander. We have maybe 70 combat-ready vessels across the entire sector." The numbers hung in the air between them like a death sentence. 300 to 70. Even with their new tactics, those odds were insurmountable. "Then what do you suggest?" Lyra asked, though part of her feared the answer. James was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant as he thought. "We don't defend Korvax," he finally said. "We make them come to us on our terms in a place where their numbers matter less. And then we don't just defeat them. We break them." Over the next 3 days, James presented his plan to Lyra and her war council. The reaction was predictably hostile. "Abandon Korvax?" Admiral Torith said, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You would surrender 17 billion lives without firing a shot?" "We evacuate as many as possible," James said calmly. "Military personnel first, then critical civilian populations. We have 12 days. We can save millions, maybe billions if we start now." "And the production facilities?" Commander Varix demanded. "The shipyards that represent generations of our technological advancement?" "We destroy them," James said. "Everything of value we either take or demolish. We leave the Skorliks nothing but empty buildings and poisoned resources." "This is cowardice," another officer spat. "The Tauron do not run from battle." "The Tauron are dying," James said, his voice sharp for the first time since Lyra had met him. "I've reviewed your casualty reports. At your current attrition rate, your species will be extinct within 18 months. So you can cling to your pride and die with honor, or you can adapt and survive. Your choice." The room erupted in angry shouts. Several officers called for James to be removed from the council. One demanded he be imprisoned for suggesting such treachery. Through it all, James stood quietly, his face calm, waiting for the storm to pass. Lyra watched him and felt something shift in her perception. This was not the quiet, unremarkable human she had married out of duty. This was a warrior who understood that true courage sometimes meant making decisions that others would call cowardice. He was willing to be hated if it meant saving lives. "Silence," Lyra commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. The room fell quiet immediately. She looked at James. "Explain the rest of your plan." James brought up a star map, showing a region of space between Korvax and the nearest Tauron stronghold. The Veiled Expanse. A nebula field with severe electromagnetic interference and unstable gravitational eddies. Navigation is difficult, sensors are unreliable, and long-range communication is nearly impossible. Which is why it has never been used for military operations, Varix said. Ships that enter that region often never emerge. "Exactly why it's perfect," James replied. "We seed the nebula with sensor beacons and navigation markers, creating safe routes that only we know. Then we lure the Skorliks fleet into the expanse and engage them where their numbers and their hive communication become weaknesses instead of strengths." Admiral Torith leaned forward, his ancient eyes narrowing. "You want to fragment their fleet. Separate them into small groups that can't coordinate with each other. And then hunt them," James finished. "Small unit engagements where skill and training matter more than raw numbers. We turn their swarm into isolated targets and destroy them piece by piece." "It is a bold plan," Torith said slowly. "Perhaps too bold. If even one element fails, our entire fleet could be destroyed in that nebula. If we fight them conventionally at Korvax, our fleet will definitely be destroyed," James countered. "This way we at least have a chance." Lyra studied the map, her tactical mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. The plan was insane. It required perfect timing, flawless execution, and an enormous amount of luck. It also required trusting this human completely, betting the survival of her species on his judgment. "We will need every ship we can muster," she said. "And every crew will need training in nebula navigation and small unit tactics. We have 12 days to prepare for the most important battle of this war." "Commander," Varix said urgently, "I must protest. This plan abandons everything our military stands for. If we survive, we will be remembered as the generation that threw away our honor." Lyra looked at her second in command, seeing the genuine distress in his eyes. She understood his pain. She felt it herself, the weight of abandoning traditions that had defined her people since before her ancestors had reached for the stars. "If we die," she said quietly, "we will be remembered not at all. I choose survival over honor, Commander. And I hope history will forgive us." The next 12 days were a frenzy of preparation. The evacuation of Korvax began immediately, with transport ships running continuous shuttles to move civilians to safer systems. James worked with Tauron engineers to place demolition charges throughout the production facilities, ensuring nothing of value would fall into Skorlik's hands. Meanwhile, the fleet trained relentlessly in the nebula tactics that would determine their fate. Lyra found herself spending more time with James during this period, not just as commander and advisor, but as genuine partners in strategy. They would sit for hours in the tactical room, debating approaches and contingencies. She began to appreciate the way his mind worked, how he could see patterns and possibilities that her more rigid training had taught her to ignore. One night, 5 days before the estimated Skorlik's arrival, they sat together reviewing deployment plans. The flagship was quiet, most of the crew resting before the coming battle. James had his head in his hands, rubbing his temples against an obvious headache. "You push yourself too hard," Lyra observed. "There's too much to do," James replied. "Too many variables, too many things that could go wrong." "You cannot control everything, Captain." "No commander can." James looked up at her, and for the first time she saw real fear in his eyes. "If this fails, Commander, if my plan gets your people killed, I don't know how I'll live with that." Lyra was surprised by his vulnerability. In her culture, leaders never admitted doubt, never showed weakness. But somehow James's honesty made him seem stronger, not weaker. "The burden of command," she said softly. "I know it well. But you do not carry this alone, James. This is my decision, my responsibility. If we fail, the weight falls on me." It was the first time she had used his given name. James noticed, his eyes widening slightly. "Thank you, Lyra," he said quietly. And there it was again, that small shift in their relationship. They were no longer just commander and captain, bound by duty and tradition. They were Lyra and James, two warriors facing impossible odds together. On the 12th day, long-range sensors detected the Skorlik's fleet. 347 ships, the largest concentration of enemy forces seen in the entire war. They were moving toward Korvax exactly as James had predicted. "Send the final evacuation order," Lyra commanded. "All remaining personnel are to withdraw immediately. Activate the demolition sequences." Across the Korvax system, massive explosions blossomed as the production facilities self-destructed. Centuries of technological achievement turned to fire and debris in seconds. Lyra watched the destruction through the sensor feeds, feeling each explosion like a physical blow. But she kept her face impassive, her voice steady. "All ships to designated positions in the veiled expanse," she ordered. "Operation God's Hammer is now active." The Tauron fleet withdrew, leaving Korvax empty and destroyed. The Skorliks arrived hours later to find ruins and corpses. Their biological ships circled the devastated system, searching for their prey. And then, as James had predicted, they detected the Tauron fleet's energy signatures leading toward the nebula. The Skorliks took the bait. 347 ships entered the veiled expanse in a massive swarm, confident in their overwhelming numbers. They did not know they were entering a trap. The nebula's electromagnetic interference hit them immediately. Their hive communication network began to fragment as ships lost contact with each other. The gravitational eddies scattered their formations, pulling ships off course into different sections of the nebula. Within hours, the unified Skorlik swarm had broken into dozens of smaller groups, each operating independently in the murky chaos. That was when the Tauron and human forces struck. Lyra led Group Alpha personally, taking the Sovereign Dawn deep into the nebula's most dangerous regions. They found a cluster of 30 Skorlik ships struggling to navigate through a particularly dense gas cloud. The Tauron vessels emerged from concealment, firing at point-blank range before the enemy could react. The battle was brutal and close. Tauron energy lances carved through Skorlik's bioarmor while the enemy's plasma cannons scorched white hulls. Ships maneuvered between debris and gravitational anomalies, hunting each other through the murk like predators in a primordial ocean. But the Tauron had the advantage now. They knew the terrain, they could communicate through the interference using the beacon network James had established, and they were fighting in small groups where their superior training showed. The Skorliks, accustomed to overwhelming opponents with coordinated swarm tactics, found themselves isolated and outmatched. Group by group, the Skorlik's fleet was torn apart. James commanded the human contingent from his flagship, the UHNS Indomitable. He had studied the nebula for days, memorizing every gravitational eddy and safe passage. Now he used that knowledge like a weapon, leading Skorlik's forces into gravitational traps where their ships would be crushed or sending them into dead-end regions where they could be ambushed. The human ships moved through the nebula like ghosts, appearing from nowhere to strike and then vanishing before the enemy could mount a counterattack. James coordinated with the Tauron groups through the beacon network, directing forces to where they were needed most, predicting enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. On the third day of the battle, Lyra's group encountered the enemy command cluster. 50 Skorlik ships, including what appeared to be their fleet coordination vessel, a massive organic construct 3 times the size of any other enemy ship. It pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, clearly trying to re-establish communication with the scattered Skrillex forces. "That's their command node," James said over the communication channel. "If we destroy it, the rest of the fleet will lose all coordination. They'll be just individual ships with no unified strategy." "Then we destroy it," Lyra said. "Group Alpha, prepare for assault. All human forces converge on these coordinates." What followed was the most intense fighting of the entire battle. The Skrillex command ship was heavily defended, its armor thick and its weapons numerous. The smaller escort vessels fought with desperate ferocity, throwing themselves at the attacking ships with suicidal determination. The Sovereign Dawn took heavy damage, its shields failing under concentrated fire. Lyra felt her ship shudder with each impact, heard damage reports flooding in from all sections. But she pressed the attack, knowing this was the critical moment. The human ships arrived like avenging angels, their weapons blazing. James had brought every vessel he could spare, committing everything to this single engagement. The Indomitable positioned itself between the Sovereign Dawn and the enemy command ship, absorbing fire that would have destroyed Lyra's flagship. "James, pull back," Lyra shouted. "Your ship cannot take that much damage. Just keep firing, Commander." James replied, his voice strained but determined. "We didn't come this far to fail now." The Indomitable's hull began to buckle under the assault, atmosphere venting from multiple breaches. But the human ship held its position, shields flaring brilliant blue as they absorbed shot after shot. And in that moment, Lyra understood what James was doing. He was sacrificing his ship, his crew, himself if necessary, to give her the opening she needed. "All forward batteries, concentrate fire on the command ship's central mass," Lyra ordered. "Maximum power. Fire." The Sovereign Dawn's energy lances lashed out, joined by fire from a dozen other Tauron vessels. The beams converged on the Skrillex command ship, burning through armor and flesh and whatever strange biology powered the creature. The massive vessel shuddered, its bioluminescent patterns flickering and dying. And then it exploded. The destruction of the command ship sent a shockwave through the nebula, both physical and psychological. Across the battlefield, the remaining Skrillex ships faltered. Their coordinated movements became erratic, then panicked. Without their guiding intelligence, they were just individual creatures, confused and frightened. All forces pressed the attack. Lyra commanded. "Give them no time to recover." The battle continued for another 6 hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. One by one, the Skrillex ships were hunted down and destroyed. Some tried to flee the nebula, only to be intercepted by Tauron forces waiting at the exits. Others simply drifted, their crews apparently unable to function without the Hive network. When it was finally over, 347 Skrillex ships had been reduced to debris. The Tauron and human forces had lost 18 vessels, a horrific price but nothing compared to the enemy casualties. Lyra stood on her damaged bridge, looking at the tactical display showing the scope of their victory. Around her, her crew was cheering, celebrating a triumph that had seemed impossible just days ago. But all she could think about was James. "Get me the Indomitable," she ordered. "Now." The communication channel opened to show James's bridge. It was a disaster area with smoke and sparks and crew members working frantically to contain fires and seal hull breaches. But James was there, alive, his face covered in soot and blood but smiling. "Commander Voss," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm pleased to report that Operation God's Hammer was a success." "You damned fool," Lyra said, and she was shocked to feel tears on her face. "You nearly got yourself killed." "Nearly doesn't count," James replied. "We're still here and they're not. I'd call that a win." Lyra wanted to say more, wanted to tell him things she didn't fully understand herself. But instead she said, "When we return to base, Captain Sullivan, you and I need to have a serious discussion about proper tactical coordination." "Looking forward to it, Commander," James said, still smiling. The return to the fleet's rallying point took 3 days. Ships limped through space, many of them barely functional, held together by emergency repairs and the determination of their crews. But they were returning as victors, carrying news of a triumph that would change the entire course of the war. When they arrived, Admiral Torith was waiting. The ancient commander had watched the battle through long-range sensors, seeing the impossible become reality. As Lyra's shuttle docked with the command station, she found Torith standing at attention, along with what seemed like every ranking officer in the sector. "Commander Voss," Torith said formally, "I have been authorized by the High Council to convey their gratitude and admiration for your victory. You have given our people hope when we had none." "The credit belongs to many," Lyra said. To every crew that fought with courage and skill. And especially to Captain James Sullivan, whose tactical brilliance made this victory possible. James had arrived with her, still looking exhausted and battered. He stood quietly beside her, seeming uncomfortable with the attention. Torith approached James, studying him with those ancient eyes. Then, slowly, the Admiral performed the gesture of respect reserved for the greatest Tauron warriors, pressing his fist to his chest and bowing his head. Captain Sullivan, Torith said. In our language, we have a word for warriors who turn the tide of impossible battles. We call them Crefthor, Stormbringer. One who brings the fury of the heavens against our enemies. He paused. You have earned this title through your actions. You are Crefthor James Sullivan, and the Tauron Empire honors you as one of our own. James looked stunned. Lyra knew what this meant. Crefthor was a title given perhaps once in a generation, reserved for legends. By granting it to a human, Torith was acknowledging James as equal to the greatest warriors in Tauron history. I am honored, Admiral, James said quietly. But I only did what was necessary. The real courage was shown by those who trusted me enough to try something new. Humility as well as skill, Torith said with approval. You will go far, Crefthor, if you live long enough. Over the following weeks, word of the victory spread through what remained of the Tauron Empire. The destruction of the largest Skorlix fleet gave other species courage to resist. Systems that had been preparing to surrender instead began fortifying their defenses. The tide of the war had not turned completely, but for the first time in 3 years, it had at least stopped rising. Lyra found her relationship with James changing in subtle ways. They still worked together daily, planning future operations and training exercises. But now there was an ease between them, a trust that went beyond duty. They began sharing meals together, talking not just about tactics but about their lives, their cultures, their hopes for the future. One evening, they stood together in the observation deck of the Sovereign Dawn, watching stars drift past. The flagship had been repaired, its white hull gleaming once more, but Lyra could still see the scars from the battle. She suspected her ship, like herself, would carry those marks forever. Do you ever regret it? She asked suddenly. Agreeing to this marriage bond? Coming here to fight our war? James was quiet for a moment. At first I thought it was just duty. An assignment, a mission to complete. But now... He turned to look at her, his gray eyes reflecting the starlight. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Your people, your culture, the way you face impossible odds with such courage, you've changed how I see everything. You changed us as well, Lyra said softly. You showed us that strength comes not from tradition but from the ability to adapt. That true honor is in survival, not in dying beautifully for a lost cause. I learned that from humans, James said. We're stubborn that way. We refuse to accept defeat even when everyone tells us we should. Lyra smiled, a rare expression that transformed her usually stern face. Perhaps that is why we work well together. The Tauron and the humans. We are both too stubborn to quit. James reached out hesitantly and took her hand. It was the first time they had touched beyond formal ceremony. His hand was smaller than hers, warm and calloused from work. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. What is it? This bond between us, James said carefully. It started as duty, as a political necessity. But I don't want it to stay that way. I don't want us to just be allies bound by ceremony. I want... He trailed off, searching for words. You want it to be real, Lyra finished. Yes, James said simply. Lyra looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. She saw not the unremarkable human she had dismissed weeks ago, but the warrior who had stood beside her through the darkest hours. The man who had been willing to sacrifice everything for her people. The partner who had taught her that change was not betrayal of tradition, but its evolution. It is real, she said quietly. It has been for some time. I simply did not realize it until I thought I might lose you. James smiled, that small expression that she had learned to value. So what do we do now? Now, Lyra said, we finish this war. We save my people and yours. We prove that when Tauron and humans stand together, nothing in this galaxy can defeat us. She paused. And then, perhaps, we see where this bond leads us. I like that plan, James said, though it might take a while to complete. Then it is fortunate, Lyra replied, pulling him closer, that we have time. They stood together in the observation deck as the stars drifted past, two warriors from different worlds who had found in each other something neither had expected. The war was far from over. The Skorlix would return, would adapt, would continue to threaten everything they held dear. But Lyra no longer faced that future with despair. She faced it with hope, with strategy, and with a partner who had risen from duty to become something far greater. A partner who had earned the title of God of War not through brutality, but through brilliance. Not through strength alone, but through the courage to think differently. As the Sovereign Dawn sailed through the darkness, carrying them toward whatever battles awaited, Lyra allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they might actually win. And when the war was over, when peace finally came, there would be time to explore this connection that had grown between them. For now, it was enough to stand together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. The God of War and the Commander. The human and the Tauron. Partners, allies, and perhaps something more. The galaxy had brought them together through necessity. But what they had become was entirely their choice. And that, Lyra thought, made all the difference.